What's important is the effects that Christianity has actually created.
No, it's
and
not.
What it's actually brought about. Absolutely.
It's about what the Bible says. Christianity is based on the book.
And we're talking about...
And the book says slavery is okay. You can buy and sell slaves at your will.
Let me continue. It's about the actual effects. Most people throughout history are not going to agree with your interpretation. There's a reason the abolitionist movement came out through the Christian movement.
It did not.
It definitely did.
Every tradition, every structure, every government, every moral framework commits atrocities. Every single one of them. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about comparing the core values of a moral tradition to another one or a lack thereof.
What are the core values of Christianity? Because my reading of the Bible is that the core value of Christianity is that men are more equal than women. Men are higher status. Slavery is okay. Genocide's okay.
So on that note, I mean, that you said that's your reading. It's not important about what your reading is. It's about what's important is the effects that Christianity has actually created.
No, it's
and
not.
What it's actually brought about. Absolutely.
It's about what the Bible says. Christianity is based on the book.
And we're talking about...
And the book says slavery is okay. You can buy and sell slaves at your will.
Let me continue. It's about the actual effects. Most people throughout history are not going to agree with your interpretation. There's a reason the abolitionist movement came out through the Christian movement.
It did not.
It definitely did.
It was absolutely not. The Christians were burning crosses on people's yards even after abolition. The Christians were quoting the Bible to endorse slavery.
Are you going to let me finish now?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So, yes, people justified slavery in every culture. Something weird started happening in Europe and then through the American tradition is that people started saying, no, slavery should be abolished. When there are reasons, if you read John Coffey, if you read Robert Fogel, who is not a Christian, Ben Wright, the abolitionists were very much arguing from the Christian tradition that it should be abolished. Did Christians try to justify slavery? Absolutely. Everyone, everywhere tried to justify slavery. But surprisingly, as historians will note on this issue, over time, through the Christian tradition, they started saying, hey, there's certain things in the Bible which demand that we end slavery. So now, this is, again, what most historians will say, out of the Christian tradition, we see a strong abolitionist movement. These early abolitionists were citing biblical verses, biblical values for their reason to end slavery.
And so were the enslavers.
And John Brown, who was deeply motivated by Christianity, walked up to slavers and blasted them in the face without question, murdering tons of people. And the taking of Harper's Ferry, the most famous moment. People don't realize John Brown and his sons and his gang were going through Kansas and straight up murdering people without question because they said you are an affront to God. Mm-hmm. So we can talk about the abolitionists. Like, it's remarkable to me. You go to the casino down the street, and they've got $25 chips with John Brown, hailed as a hero, despite the fact that he was hanged for treason. And I'm like, look, man, I appreciate the abolitionist stuff, but I don't know that I'd ever get behind a guy who would walk up to a random person and blow his face off. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not the kind of world. But that was Christianity, right? Obviously, this country was like 99% Christian at the time. I mean, that meant that abolitionists and they were all Christians.
Everyone,
nobody gets credit
for text.
it.
Yeah, no, you don't get credit for using the Bible to abolish it. In fact, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, said, "Who gave them the right to decide that it's a sin? By what standard do they measure it? Not the Constitution. The Constitution recognizes the property in many forms, imposes obligations in its connection that in that recognition, not the Bible." It justifies it. And then he says later, it is not the cause of Christianity. It cannot be. For servitude is the only agency through which Christianity has reached the degraded race, the only means by which they have been civilized and elevated. And church fathers all throughout history said the same thing. Basil said it. Ambrose said it. There were dozens of church fathers and popes who all said that slavery was the means by which we're going to bring these heathen races to Christianity because Leviticus 25 says so.
But it's a moot point. Mm-hmm. Christians also abolished slavery. Nobody gets credit for it. So therefore, it's not of Christianity. It's moot. We can sit here and be like, did you know that Christians abolished slavery? Sure, they also did it too. Okay, it's zero. What's the next point?
But the justification for it is in the Bible. That's what I'm saying.
And every country, every nation, every peoples in the world had slavery. To this day, the North African slave trade has been reignited due to the operations of American constitutional republicanism. So if we're going to talk about who's at fault for slavery, right now it's the American democratic system. Should we abolish it? I don't think so. But it is the absolute fault of Western NATO countries who are not abiding by some religious doctrine, who blew the crap out of Libya, reigniting the North African slave trade. I said Atlantic. North African slave trade. So history shows us everybody did slavery. Christians did too. Christians justified slavery at the time. Muslims did too. Christians abolished slavery, and then Western constitutional republicanism reignited slavery.
And
So I'm not going to sit here and argue that the Constitution in America is bad. I think it's a great country with evil people wielding us like a tool to evil ends.
And again, we go back to my point. Everyone justified slavery from their traditions in the ancient world. Why do we now think slavery is wrong today? Go back and read what the abolitionists were doing. There was something in Christianity that started. Did most people early on try to justify it? Absolutely. But the abolitionists were not arguing from Enlightenment ideas, secular ideas. I mean, one of the earliest anti-slavery texts is called The Selling of Joseph for a reason. They were arguing from the Christian tradition. Okay, so there was something moving within Christianity that Tom Holland talks about that did eventually lead to this new change in our ethics and our understanding of slavery that did get abolished, that did lead to its abolishing it. So there was something within it that did lead. It didn't happen in Muslim countries. It didn't happen in the Far East. Even early enlightened thinkers like Voltaire and David Hume were trying to justify slavery. So, I mean, like everyone tried to justify slavery. The question we need to ask is what motivated the abolitionists? And you can again say, yeah, Christians did justify slavery. That doesn't challenge the fact that what the abolitionists were using and arguing from.
Right. But there have been multiple societies that abolished slavery many thousands of years prior to the U.S. There was a dynasty in China in the BC era that abolished slavery for a time period. There was a leader in India for a period of a couple hundred years where slavery was abolished. There were Stoics in Greece that were abolitionists.
No, there weren't. There weren't any Stoics.
There actually was. Seneca.
No, he did not say slavery should be abolished. No.
Seneca,
Epictetus was, for example, an early slave.
Seneca absolutely advocated for getting rid of slavery, said it was an immoral institution.
He said it was immoral. He didn't say it should go away. There was evil.
There was quite a few Stoics that agreed with him.
They agreed slavery was bad, but they didn't call for abolition. The first person that called for the abolition of slavery, Gregory of Nyssa.
That is wrong.
No, Gregory of Nyssa is the first person.
He's the first Christian that talked about abolishing slavery, but he was outruled by the other church fathers.
Exactly.
The other church fathers disagreed with him.
But no, he's the first person in history to call for the abolition.
So he certainly is not the first person in history. In fact, I already quoted you. There's I think the Wing dynasty in China, and then there's another dynasty in India that abolished it.
No,
way
I'm talking
before
about universal abolition. That
was universally abolitioned.
I have a fact check. Seneca did not explicitly advocate for abolishing slavery. While he criticized the mistreatment of slaves and encouraged humane treatment, he accepted slavery as a social institution. The sources for this are Moral Letters to Lucilius, letter 47, and Seneca De Beneficiis, book 3, chapter 18. And then there is a book in 1994 discussing Rome's attitudes towards slavery called Bradley Keith's Slavery Society in Rome.
Would he have been Seneca have been executed if he'd called for the abolition of it?
I don't think he would have been executed. It's just Kyle Harper talks about this in his book. It's just no one even questioned it. It's like trying to say, could we get rid of water
or money?
Yeah, they just knew that this was just something that could never go away.
Money's a really good example. I think people need to understand when we talk about slavery in the United States, most people they envision a black man in a field being beaten by a slave owner. They don't realize how pervasive and widespread the institution of slavery was beyond farming and in the South. There were cobblers, black men who were trained to make shoes, who worked in cities and ran shoe stores where they transacted. But slavery meant that they had no legal rights. That means there was a person who owned them and they wanted them to do this job. There's also an important factor in that they were, depending on what the slave owner or the slave master wanted, they could make money for themselves. And in fact, Frederick Douglass bought his own freedom and then later bought the freedom of his wife and his child. It shouldn't have happened that way.
No.
But, and obviously slavery is bad. The reason I bring this up is, I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Slavery was viewed as exactly as we would view something like money, an economic institution that exists and is a function of government. And then slowly over time, sentiments towards it started to shift in the direction, and it ended up with a very bloody war in the United States. Now, for other, like the UK, they basically just said, we're ending slavery, and then we're going to have to pay back everybody for taking their slaves away from them. They did a big debt, and then they ended up paying. It took them like 100 years to pay off the debt.
It took a good 100 years. It started early with like Anabaptists and Methodists working together, and eventually they started to get legislation passed. They got rid of the slave trade in some new territories under William Penn, and then shortly after they abolished the slave trade throughout the British Empire, and then a couple decades later they emancipated slaves. So it was a slow process.
We'll shift a little bit now. I'll jump to my good friend Bill Maher. All right, go for it.
Before you get too far, the emperor that abolished slavery in China was not Wing, it was Wang. I apologize for that. And that was in the first century. In India, hundreds of years before that, there was Ashoka who abolished slavery. Now, it came back years later, but early abolitionists existed throughout the world.
So I want to shift to our good friend Bill Maher. Not really a good friend, but he's not that bad. He's all right. Obviously, he made that documentary Religulous, and he goes around challenging people's views and things as such, and that's always okay. The reason I bring him up is that Dennis Prager made a good example. He has a good example of moral tradition and where you go when you destroy it. And he calls it. I always get it wrong. Cut stem politics, something like this, where he basically says you have the root of a society, which in his view is the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. He's Jewish, obviously. And it grows into this beautiful flower that someone then cuts from the stem and holds up in the air and shows everyone how beautiful it is. But you know that once it's cut from its roots, it will eventually start to die. And that's where we're at right now. You can hold up this beautiful American society, but as in his view, Judeo-Christian values wane, it eventually is going to die. Thanks for watching this clip from the Culture War podcast. We're live every Friday, 10 a.m. to noon, so subscribe and come hang out.